This recording was produced by Oregon Trail Baptist Church. If you'd like to get more recordings, or to leave your feedback, please visit us at www.otbchurch.com or write us at P.O. Box 298, Guernsey, Wyoming 82214. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope that today's recording will not just challenge your thinking, but will transform your life.
All right, so here we have, it's kind of an interesting section, and it's a section I'm not sure I have a nice, clean-cut, good answer for, which I'll just be blunt and honest. We're renewing the covenant at this point. The people have sinned. It's been dealt with, the golden calf incident. They're moving on from this. This is where Moses has gone up. He's getting the Ten Commandments all over again. The tablets are being written by God, but Moses chisels out the tablets, as we had earlier in this chapter. But what we get here, as far as the covenant, do we get a listing of the Ten Commandments? No. What do we get instead? Laws. Now, are they new, or are they ones they've already received? And it seems like most of these are laws that after Exodus 20 and the chapters following, they're picking up the different laws within that section. But it's not rehashing all of those chapters all over again. It's just hand-picking or cherry-picking a few. But in some ways, these laws also picture or represent broader swaths of the law. Does that make some sense? So let's work through a few of these. I don't want to dive in too deep here. I'm not clear. Sometimes it's helpful to just ask the question, why was this included here? Why did Moses, under inspiration, write this way here? And sometimes you start to pick up things, and other times you scratch your head and you just don't have good answers. I'm at this point here. Verse 10 reminds us that what God is going to do will be a special work with Israel. They will be unique among the nations. What God will do with His people will be special, will be unique. And if you think about the conquest, and you think about how God treated His people and how He interceded for them, bringing down fire and stone from heaven at points, bringing hornets or wasps into the land, or just taking a bunch of nomadic people not trained for war and leading them to victory, bringing the walls of Jericho down. God fought for His people. And He did something for them. And here we've already seen like the crossing of the Red Sea. So God's doing things that no other nation has seen. They know that God has power. He's unique. And then He enters into this promise again that He's going to drive out their enemies. Now in connection with that, verse 12, they're not to make any alliances with their neighbors. Did they obey that? No. Can you think of a clear instance where they... It starts the Gibeonites, okay? And yes, they were deceived into the whole thing, but they still made a treaty with one of their close neighbors, even though they were deceived into it. They weren't listening to or trusting the Lord. Verses 13 to 16, really to summarize that, there's to be absolutely no hint of idolatry. We have the language here of destroying their altars, breaking their images, cutting down their groves. For thou shalt, verse 14, thou shalt worship no other God, the Lord, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. This brings up an interesting point that I think is worth considering. When we think of jealousy, do we normally think of that as a good or a bad thing? Normally it's bad. Okay? Is there a difference between jealousy and envy? Okay, I'm getting some head shaking. Good. So what would the difference between jealousy and envy be? Okay. Okay, yeah, you're hitting on it. So envy, you're wanting something that somebody else has that doesn't rightfully belong to you. Okay? So whether it's a position, whether it's an object, whether it's whatever, you want something that's not yours, i.e. the whole concept of coveting in Scripture. You're desiring something, and that desire makes it to where you're unhappy, and it affects you emotionally and mentally because you can't have this thing. Jealousy, on the other hand, is something that can go either way. It's more like jealousy is maybe the broader umbrella term. Envy is always bad, but jealousy can be good. It's a good thing for God to be jealous over His people. They are His people. It's a good thing for parents to be jealous over their children, in that they watch out for their children and care for their children and watch out and protect and provide for their spouse and kids, their family. It's a good thing. Now, in the context I brought up of family, can it go too far to where it becomes a bad thing? Yeah. Oh yeah. And thus we have millennial parents have been given the term helicopter parents. Have you guys heard that? I wouldn't know it except I read it in a book that is describing millennials, but they hover over their children. They want to know why exactly you didn't get an A in this grade and why everybody you didn't win they hover so much and they don't let the kids really sprout their wings because they're propping them up with everything they can. All right, that's a level of it's gone too far. The Bible refers to God several times as a jealous God. He will not be placed among other idols or small g gods. He won't be placed among them as one of the ones you worship. You worship Him and you worship Him alone, period. And because He's the only creator God, the God who rules the universe, the God, you don't worship these other gods. He's jealous of His status and position there. And it's a good thing. So the term, several times in Scripture, uses of God as a jealous God. It never uses the term that He's an envious God. So that helps us somewhat in that distinction. So does that clear that up a little, or did I just throw that everywhere? So, all right. So anyway, there's a bit of distinction there. God is a jealous God. He doesn't want any hint of this foreign worship. And what seems to be God's concern? Why He doesn't want any hint of idolatry, any hint of the false worship? This gets into the fact that there's a few things happening. They're not supposed to marry others outside of Israel at this point. He doesn't want them even curious and exploring these other ways to worship. It will. And very much here in the ancient thinking, the Israelites were still learning about the Lord. In the ancient Near Eastern concept, the general thought of your God, of a nation, whatever, is He controls this territory. That's why when, I can't remember who was attacking, but it was under King Ahab, they said, they beat us in the plains because their God is a God of the plains and not a God of the hills. So we'll fight them in the hills and we'll beat them there instead. And the Lord, even though the king at that point was evil and not doing what he wanted, the Lord made a point to let Israel win, simply to show that, yep, I'm the God of the plains and the hills. So they thought, in the ancient Near Eastern mindset, they thought more of their gods as having controls of regions of land, much like governments have control of certain regions today. But God is going beyond that with His people. And He's going to get them moved beyond that. But at this point, the Israelites were susceptible, and even as they were in the land. So how did this Baal worship go? Because the land was real fruitful before we got here, and we've had a few years of drought. Never mind the fact we haven't been obeying Yahweh. But how did this Baal worship go? And kind of that curiosity to bring back and learn the ways of the people there. So that's completely forbidden here. We also have here verse 8. Let's see. No hint of idolatry, verses 13 to 16. They weren't to make any images of God, verse 17. Again, this is very, very much similar to what's pulled straight out of the Ten Commandments. They should keep the feast of unleavened bread. What was that feast? Does anybody remember? Passover. Okay, so there's that feast is by this point in the book of Exodus, it's starting to evolve a little bit more in how they celebrate that feast, but it's to remember what it meant. Remember that God delivered them. He redeemed them. He brought them out of Egypt. And so they have it in the month Abib, the first month of their year. And there they eat the unleavened bread, reminding them of the haste and reminding them of the Lord bringing them out of Egypt. All right, so we have then also verses 19 to 20. The firstborn of Israel belongs to God. I covered this before, so I didn't include it in this lesson. Where the pagan nations would often sacrifice their firstborn child, what would happen with if your firstborn child was offered to the Lord in Israel? What did that mean? They weren't sacrificed. What did they usually do? Okay, they're either in some capacity they would serve the Lord or serve the temple structure in some way, or you would pay to redeem them, and you would pay a price on top of that to redeem the price of that and kind of pay to the Lord. So it's kind of nuanced, and there's a bit of discussion there, but it was clearly distinct from the pagan nations, because never did God ask for a human sacrifice, with the exception of Isaac, which that's a whole other issue. All right, so. Anyway, verse 21, Israel will observe the Sabbath. This out of all the commandments seems to be the one that keeps getting hit and repeated. And I think there's some reasons for that, and we'll hit that in the next lesson. Also, verse 23, Israel, their males would appear before the Lord 3 times in a year. And in verse 24, I think gives us the reason for some reasoning behind this, because if you think about it, if you're a nation and all of the males, children, and adults are heading to the capital city for a few times in a feast of the year, if you were a neighboring country and you were eyeing their land to take it, when would you attack? When they're gone. So there seems to be, even here in verse 24, he says, I will cast out the nations before thee, and enlarge thy borders, neither shall any man desire thy land when thou go up to appear before the Lord thy God thrice in a year. So God's promising them, look, when you set time out and you obey me, and you are following the ordinances and the instructions I've given you, I will even put it in your enemy's heart. They won't even want to come take your land when you're gone. It's like leaving your front door open and expecting nobody to come and steal, all right? So the Lord is promising His protection and on His people, but what are they doing in exchange? They're devoting their lives, their livelihood, their attention to Him. Alan Cole notes here, he says, this is a needed word of assurance to the man who obeys the command to attend the festival. The godly farmer may well fear that his less godly Israelite neighbor, hardly a foreigner, if these had been driven out, may move his landmark. Okay, remember the stones and stuff they would set up to mark their land, and steal his land while he is absent on a pilgrimage. So, let alone take over the land. God promised to protect His people. Verse 25, we get into the sacrifices. They could not be made with leaven. Leaven throughout Scripture is a picture of what? Sin, okay? And it's a very vivid picture because it when you put it in a loaf of bread or you put it in the dough, it permeates and saturates and goes through the whole thing. So it seems like that's consistent with that picture, whether the Israelites understood why or not. It seems to be very consistent with that picture of why leaven would be left out of sacrifices. Also, it couldn't be left until the morning. You didn't have leftovers from the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You didn't have leftovers from that meal. It was all consumed and it was done with and moved on to the morning. Verse 26 has one that I've mentioned several times before, but it says, "You shall not see the kid in the mother's milk," towards the end of that verse. What's that talking about? So what is it to see the kid in the mother's milk? Okay, yeah, you're boiling the younger piece of livestock, whatever it is, in the milk of the mother. So this is where some of the kosher food laws come in. With you don't have hamburger with cheese. Dairy and meat don't go together. You can't do that. Somehow it's extra cruel to have a hamburger. And although that has developed its own tradition, and although most Jews would fight very, very vehemently that that's what this verse is talking about, we now know from archaeology, that from Canaanite text and rituals, that this act of cooking a goat or a kid in the mother's milk of the goat was part of a magical ritual practice that they would do in their sacrifices and their observance. So, now put that back in the context of this passage. God's really concerned that his people are devoted to him, and he's concerned that they completely stay away from any idolatrous practice, any worship of other gods, staying away from any of those practices. So, it seems to fit better here that this is not talking about cheese on your hamburger, but rather it's talking about, I'm not going to do any practices that are even close to how the Canaanites practiced their worship and how they interacted with the gods or the false gods. So, yeah.
Just thinking about this whole passage here. You're saying there's the way that to me, it seems pretty simple. They have just sinned against God. Now Moses has gone back and he's got all the commandments again. Ones he wants to emphasize are the ones that build them and their relationship with God. I mean, he starts out first, I love you, you're my people.
Right.
Don't forget that. I haven't kicked you out just because of what you did. And then he goes in and starts talking about what they need to go and keep themselves pure.
I wonder if some of the ones specifically mentioned are mentioned because they were specific sins that were done in Exodus 32. So, for instance,
Or very potential.
right. Because, and the reason I say some is like this one here. It is feasible that they did this practice of seething a kid in the mother's milk as part of the riotous party they were having with the golden calf. That we could see happening. Having the Feast of Unleavened Bread and some of that repeated, well, it wasn't the right time frame for them to be doing that with the golden calf. So, while reviewing the whole covenant and reaffirming the covenant, it may be picking up certain ones that are just really fresh on their minds because you just did this type. Which is why it might feel disjunct to us because we don't have in Exodus 32, all right, they broke this commandment, this commandment. We don't have it quite laid out like that. So, anyway, yeah, that's... Thank you. I didn't get that out as well earlier, and your comment helped me bring that into the discussion. See here, Moses records God's words. All right, so moving from the commandment, Moses is recording this. He stays up there for 40 days, fasting during that time. Then he returns to the camp in 29. And what is going on with his face? It's shining. He's been in the presence of the Lord. His face is shining, so much so the people are afraid of it. And there seems to be kind of some back and forth, like, okay, Moses says, stay off. We're not so sure about this. Now, is that the first time the people have had that type of response to an encounter with God? No, they had that type of response earlier where they're like, Moses, you go on up the mount for us. We're not so sure about this. We don't want to die. And then later Moses and the elders and Joshua go up the mountain, but the people stay back. Again, this is strange. This is new. This is unique. This is the unknown. They don't know what to think or expect here. Moses gives them the commands in verses 31 and 32. And we get this note that he veils his face when he's with the people, but he unveils it when he goes in to talk to the Lord. And this kind of back and forth is happening. And Moses' face is shining. Now, I want to pull in a couple thoughts here that are kind of unique, but not in the text. At some point later, his face stopped shining. You realize that? Like, later on in the narrative, by the time we get through Leviticus and Numbers, people were talking to him. We don't have any record of him needing this veil anymore. So it's just an interesting thought that over time, it somewhat faded. Another thought I think worth considering here is Paul, I think, makes mention or alludes to this in 2 Corinthians 3. And there he writes, "But we all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord." And I think the language here, Paul's giving something for us as Christians and believers, that when we behold God's face and we look at the Lord and we see God for who He is and we set our eyes and our gaze on Jesus, when that is where our focus is, we're changed on the inside from the inside out. Much in the same way that Moses, when he's paying attention to the Lord and he's receiving instruction from Him, he's spending time with the Lord, 40 days and 40 nights. He didn't notice his face was shining. He didn't notice what had changed physically to his body until he comes down and everybody else, whoa, what happened to you? And that same type of effect is something that I think applies for all of us. It's easy for us to get focused on the problems and the difficulties and to get focused on this, that, or the other, and all the things of life that can consume our attention. But if we allow ourselves to put those aside for a little bit and let our focus be on the Lord, He begins changing us from the inside out. And so I think Paul is picking up on some of the language of this passage and using that as a picture or illustration as he's describing what he's talking about to the Corinthians in the New Testament. So, yeah.
I would say part of the other reason why that's what time was on Moses is not as brilliant of a contrast as with the other people, because one, he just spent an enormous amount of time alone with God.
Yeah.
Himself. And it was not because Moses went up there necessarily wanted to spend that much time with God, but it was necessitated on God's part to make sure Moses understood what he was trying to get across.
He's on God's timetable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So later on in his life, that was not needed, a 40-day period.
Right.
24/7
Yeah.
period. So his needs changed, and when you're going through difficult times, when you're going through times where you are real close to God, it changes from when things calm down and life evens out.
Yeah. And it's not that he wasn't trusting the Lord or depending later. Right. And so, and again, this also plays into a theme that's kind of been, I may not have emphasized it very well, but throughout the story of Moses, God has done a lot to elevate Moses in ways that place him in a position where the people should pay attention and should listen to Moses, where he's the one I'm speaking through. He's the one I'm communicating directly with. And yeah, you can trust what he's saying is true because, yeah, you saw the cloud, right? And you saw this, right? And now you see the shining face on Moses. You know he's the one that I'm speaking and working through for all of your benefit. Pay attention to him. Now, later on, do people keep that focus? No, we have his own brother and sister starting a coup against him later on. And so God is emphasizing, and God seems to do that several points. He does that with Joshua. He does it with Moses. He wants people to know clearly that this is my prophet who I have spoken through. What I'm saying through him is legit. It's my words. Listen to him, and that's a grave responsibility because those prophets, to veer off in what your own opinion is when God's given a message, not a great idea. Yeah.
Even over time, people get the message of, he is the leader. He's the one that God has put here to lead us. For the most part, yeah, you'll have little uprisings and stuff here and there of people trying to usurp authority.
Right.
But the majority of people are just going to follow it.
Right. Yeah, and that's God's setting that precedent. So. All right, I'm looking at the time, and I'm looking at, we finished out this lesson, but I don't think we have time to really even get into the next one. So, any other comments or questions or concerns or... Well, with that then, there's a few things I thought of when I was reading the text, and I'm looking through trying to find what had jogged my memory, and I don't remember them. So, it is interesting that the Ten Commandments were written on this, not these covenants. It makes clear again that what's written on here is the Ten Commandments, and it's a little bit of review. It's translated commandments, but how do I word this accurately? The Jews don't take them as commandments. They view them as 10 words or 10 statements. And so, anyway, and the same consistent wording here, it's 10 statements. It's been kicked over as commandments, but it's 10 words. And part of the reason for that is how many, if you go to Exodus 20, in the section of the Decalogue with the 10 Commandments, how many commands are given in that section? Right. 13. There's 13 actual commands given in the 10 Commandments. So that's why the Jews kind of lean towards the 10 words, 10 statements. And as they look at the 10 Commandments, the first is not a command at all. It's the first statement is, I am the Lord which brought you out of the land of Egypt. And for them, that's number one. And for most Protestants and Christians, that's what we call the preamble, the opening statement. So anyway, it is a point of just nuanced difference as you stop and think about it. And I brought it up last week, but it's interesting that in Genesis 1 and 2, through the creation narrative, God speaks how many times? 10. So, God spoke in Genesis 10 times. God now speaks to Israel with 10 words. So there's patterns happening that are kind of unique. So, Lord, we thank you for your word here this morning. And Lord, as you are admonishing your Israelites in the wake of their sin, and you're moving forward, Lord, would you, as you were calling for the Israelites to be pure and separated from the idolatrous cultures and worship systems around them, Lord, would you do the same in our hearts and lives? Lord, would we be people who are transformed by you and who radiate your glory, not people who are conformed to the world and simply go on with what everyone around us says. Would you be the deciding factor that truly changes us from the inside out? We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.